Powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite life. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. Well, again, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to this luncheon and this lecture for Mission Week. We're so glad that you're here. I want to introduce our speaker, Brother Mark Mackey, who's originally from Cincinnati, Ohio. Go Bengals! Where he went to St. Xavier High School, the Jesuit high school over there. He lacked the prudence in those days to get a Jesuit higher education degree, so he did his undergraduate work at Miami of Ohio, where he majored in zoology and environmental science. While at Miami, he published his first research in ecology, and this made for a smooth transition into continuing research at the graduate level at the University of Missouri. During graduate school, Mark rediscovered and deepened his Catholic faith and eventually left academia to see where God was calling him, and he ended up in the Society of Jesus. Like one of those prayer latherwinds, God has brought Mark full circle back to a university, and he now teaches at Loyola University's School of Environmental Sustainability. He teaches introductory environmental science, but is most excited to be teaching a new class this spring called Eco-Spirituality for Action. Amongst the lifetime of accolades and achievements, he considers being a novice classmate of John Carroll's own Jesuit Andrew Serra under the tutelage and mentorship of their novice master, John Carroll's own Father Contemplation, to be at the top. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Tom. You brought it to life. Hello, thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay? I get energized sometimes. I may walk around. I've got some mic options, so I'm feeling settled. I'm feeling welcome to John Carroll, so thank you so much. Do you all mind if I have my mask off and stay? I'll stay away. If I move around a bit, you can kind of give me the hands up, back off sign. So thank you, Tom Pitt, my novice master, one of my novice mates here. I sleep a little better knowing John Carroll is in good hands here. So if you don't know either of those Jesuits, you should go out of your way to say hello. Excited to be here just to talk during your mission week about how does this care for creation, environmental stewardship, environmental movement, what does it have to do with our mission at an Ignatian university, at an Ignatian institution. So that's just what we're going to do today, connect some of those dots, and the key theme is going to be integration. And I'll start with a little bit of how this integrated into my own story. So we'll start with my own story. We'll start about maybe how I've seen, when I looked into it, some of that integration into the broader church, some of that integration into the Society of Jesus. Everybody's going to want to know a little bit of what about some action? What can I do for action? And finally, because sometimes it's hard to know what caring for creation might look like other than just, we talk about it a lot. What does it look like? I've got what I think is a pretty fun case study at Brebeuf Jesuit. So let's move on forward, and I'll try to move along enough to where we'll have some Q&A time or discussion time at the end. So let's start right here. Look at this amazing photo. Some of you may remember the 90s. Students would think this is like a theme party we were heading to, but this is just how we dressed back then. That's my dad wearing jorts and a cut-off shirt. I'm holding this fish here. I've got my pink water shoes. There's my twin sister in her tie-dye Little Mermaid outfit. So these were the good old days. But I will say, I put this up as a reminder that I feel very fortunate in that my parents, especially, and other mentors in my life, got me outdoors. They encourage what I think you've probably seen a lot of children have a natural curiosity. You can take them to a creek and you don't have to tell them what to do. They can start flipping rocks and finding crawdads and things. So thankfully that was fostered and cultivated in my childhood. And then, like Father Pitt mentioned, I moved on, and still as these experiences are happening in my youth, that's where I first encountered the Jesuit mission, if you will, right? This topic of today, this thing that you all are a part of in some way or another. At St. X, we kind of had the grad at grad. These are 5 characteristics of somebody who's graduating. Should be open to growth, intellectually competent, religious, loving, and committed to doing justice. So I could spell that out for a quiz if it was given to me, but it took a while for these things to seep in. But I was exposed to it. I did kind of take that idea of justice, and that was the first time I entered any kind of formal group. I entered St. X's Sierra Club. And I'd say that was just the one time where I started to have this dim idea of like, well, I love nature and that's important to me. It's kind of not being treated the best, so maybe that's part of that justice aspect. So early seeds of this starting to crop up, but I often wonder, what was I thinking in high school? Because I didn't have a whole lot of clarity about that. I did know that football and sports were a big thing. A lot of people think that's what Jesuit schools are about. So we'll talk about the behind the scenes stuff and the stuff that really animates our mission today. So I kind of took that advice of a lot of good mentors generally say, take that thing you're passionate about and that's what you can major in. So I was like, all right, I'll try to do that in outdoor stuff, nature stuff. And eventually that led me to go to Miami University. I studied zoology and picked up an environmental science major there. And then that kind of segued me on, especially to my research career. So I was very fortunate to have good professor mentors. I'd be willing to bet there's some of those types in this room today. And it was from them kind of taking me under their wing, teaching me just how science works. So I got the chance to work on this first project, effects of temperature and perch diameter on arboreal locomotion in the snake Elaphia guttata. So this is sort of project where people were like, cool, but why would we study that, right? I know my parents were good-natured about it, but confused. But that was a chance for me to know what science, peer-reviewed science looks like, right? After that, while I was still an undergrad, I had a chance to kind of apply that a little bit more to an applied question. What about all these pesticides that we use for our food? I mean, it's great. It's part of the meal we're having today. But and also insecticides that take care of mosquitoes for serious diseases. Those have big impacts on our environment. We've known that since Rachel Carson kind of blew the whistle on that. But I had a chance to look at that in Ohio. I got to be, I did a research experience, summer research experience for undergrads. I got to be what I called a tadpole shepherd for a summer, raising 40 different ponds of raising kind of simulated ponds and looking at how does pesticides interact with natural stressors like competition. How can we measure that? So that was also kind of starting to apply science to important stewardship questions maybe. And also exciting just to have a chance from very patient mentors to eventually bring that to research. So I brought that up just knowing that was so critical for me, a professor taking their time. I don't know if I'd have the patience for that today. So I remind myself that that's partially what helped me. So good on you if that's part of your life right now. And then finally, that just kind of segued me into graduate school, where my question, related but a little more specified, is what about golf courses? I know in 2010 there were over 1,800 golf courses in the U.S. alone. What about the impact of those? And kind of asking the question, what's going on in the waters around golf courses, and what can we do to better that habitat? So that's kind of what got me out, spending a lot more time in nature. Thankfully, I was a field ecologist, so it wasn't just about textbook and numbers. It was actually out there slinging salamanders in the southern Appalachian Mountains. Had 5 good summers down there at a research station, so good memories. And that's kind of what some of that research looked like. But so throughout this really important time of kind of learning how to be a good student, be intellectually curious, to do science, I found that there was something missing in those days. See, oh, look at that transition to the mobile mic. There was something missing for me. It was kind of a depth to what I was doing. It was external and internal. Externally, I was like, hey, it's fun to be part of a conservation biology lab, but it still doesn't quite seem like we're getting deep enough into what's causing the environmental issues our Earth faces. And the other piece of this, too, was something was missing more in my personal life and my faith journey, I would say. I had kind of left that behind to say next. And it's kind of funny that if I looked at the stack of books that I had been reading for like my comprehensive exams, it was huge. I knew a lot about ecology and evolution stuff. If I looked at the stack of books related to my religious faith, it was like one of those flimsy picture books we got in 6th grade religion that you draw like mustaches on the photos and stuff. That's kind of, I didn't have depth. I hadn't cultivated that part of my life. So I felt that thing missing. Well, I didn't have words for this at the time, but in retrospect, I found a quote that I think captures this sentiment for me very well. This is a governmental scientist, not even necessarily a big name, but Gus Spieth says, I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and a cultural revolution or transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree with that, but that really hit home with me. That was like, that's what I was trying to say. And I've sensed that. A lot of you would know better than I do that we've had a lot of science, and it's not just that factual information that's going to change people's behavior, right? So that was a big part of the first question of like, not to say everybody should do this, but me asking, well, how can I get to that other part? How can I have in what I consider a deeper depth to get at this issue? I was fortunate, even though I didn't have the prudence to go to a Jesuit university. At Mizzou, they had the prudence to set up what they call a Newman Center. Is anybody here familiar with any kind of like graduates of a Newman Center? It was beautiful. Mizzou is a public university, but they have a Catholic student center. And that's where I was going to Mass. I still wasn't sure if I believed in that kind of thing, but I was kind of habitually going to Mass on Sundays. I was invited to go to a CLC and basically just have a chance to start asking, like, do I still, if somebody had asked me, are you a Christian? I don't know that I would have had a straightforward answer. Do you believe in God? I would have been ambivalent, so I didn't know that part. And long story short, the St. Thomas More Newman Center was a place where I could actually start to voice some of these doubts, these questions, and kind of process that. So it's a great reminder of what a blessing it is to be an institution where students feel like they can go to a person, hopefully to a professor, to a mentor, and talk about these things. It was critical for me. I also did a report. I had the opportunity to write a report, kind of like a little scholarship, and it's like you could write about how liturgy affects your life, how sacraments, a couple other things. And there was one where you could fill in your own topic, propose your own topic. So I proposed, what about this environmental stewardship in the Catholic Church? What is that? I want to take a look into that. I was pretty sure I'd find some flimsy material, and maybe that would be the last straw to leave the Catholic Church. I didn't know, but I decided I need to face this like I do my scientific questions and just go after the truth, right? And when I dipped into that world, I found there was substance there. There was substance there. There were words from popes at the time talking about how this needs to be a part of how we think about our faith. That was encouraging to hear. Hadn't heard it before. I have to give a shout out. I know this is Ignatian Mission Week, but the Franciscans, of course, do a lot of good work on an earth-based spirituality, creation spirituality. There was a book there that I found really helpful. And at a personal level, I met this Dominican. I met this priest who was at the Newman Center who had a PhD in chemistry. And I don't know if you felt this, but I had slowly imbibed this thought that smart people can't be religious. I had been in science long enough. Part of this is my own fault. Part of this is my own fault. Part of it was culture. Kind of like, well, religious belief is kind of primitive, right? And a really intellectual person isn't going to believe this religious stuff. Well, I met a PhD in chemistry who knew a lot about the faith and a lot about how the natural world worked. So that was huge. So all of you, I think it's a reminder, you can be that face that people can't discount or that might bring hope of just a smart person, a person they respect, but maybe when we are willing to kind of let people know we have that faith aspect, that can really help young people see like, okay, these don't have to be mutually exclusive. I know for whatever reasons, I needed to hear that when I was 22 years old. And then I also heard about these Jesuits who were doing all sorts of, astronomy and mathematics and impressive things even centuries ago. So it's like, okay, so there can be this coming together of science and religion. And in those days, this is pre-Laudato Si. But there were whisperings, kind of on-the-ground whisperings of this encyclical that would talk about ecology and the environment. So that'll kind of be woven into what we talk about today. I hope you have some experience with that. At least you've heard a prayer from Father Tom, who kicked us off with that. And, have you heard the term watershed moment? I didn't know exactly. I use it. Sometimes I use phrases incorrectly, so I was looking this up, and I realized I like that example of a watershed moment because it means two things. For this sake, it's a historical, unique historical change, of course, on which important developments depend. And that's what Laudato Si is for this topic of caring for creation in a faith-based tradition. It reminded me when I worked outside of Seattle in 2014. I worked at a Catholic camp for kids that would come out and learn about how their Catholic faith meets up with ecology stuff. Pretty cool little camp that I worked at. And I would ask sixth graders, hey, who here lives in a watershed? And I could ask you that. I don't want to embarrass you. But it's like, anybody live in a watershed? And people will say, well, my parents live near a river, or my grandparents live near a lake. And the lesson goes on to say, we all live in a watershed. A watershed is a geographical area of land where, if water falls, it'll drain somewhere. So we all live there, right? Even if it's not obvious. And that's what a lot of Laudato Si is. It's taking this knowledge. It's not like learning that you live in a watershed changes anything about the external world, right? You're there, whether you believe it or know it or not. And a lot of stuff that Pope Francis is saying, scientists already knew about how we're impacting ecosystems. Some people also knew, this can affect other people, but it's this watershed moment of bringing together this reality that already exists and letting us know this is true and this is part of our responsibility, right? So a true watershed moment in a couple meanings of the word. So I look on this and I realize just this little bit about my own story is a story of integration. Laudato Si is an encyclical of integration. Pope Francis talks about integral ecology, recognizing that the cry of the earth is the cry of the poor, right? This document, that might be the most important take-home, is that we can't act like, okay, we have these social issues, and then a separate thing is kind of the people who have a hobby of liking nature. That's not how reality is built. And so we're having this integration of belief at individual levels and at the level of the church, which is pretty exciting, right? Pretty exciting. And then specifically, I would say, what drew me to the Jesuits, I had developed my faith, but I was drawn to the Jesuits specifically from Ignatian spirituality. And this has been a reminder that I keep learning as a Jesuit. When you ask seasoned Jesuit veterans and seasoned John Carroll folks who have been here and worked in this context, they recognize that really what makes John Carroll unique is the Ignatian mission, what we're looking at and talking about this week. And when you dip into that, it's Ignatian spirituality, right? It's that spirituality that fueled St. Ignatius that animates what we do. And so we have to ask, what's this specific overlap of Ignatian spirituality and ecological spirituality? How can we be, press into that more? And what about our particular way of proceeding and viewing the world can make us bring more to the table of this collective? It's not just us asking these questions, but how can we bring our specific perspective to the ecological question? And I like this term because it goes to a kind of a religious change of mind, change of heart. How can we both experience and help to foster ecological conversion? That should be a question on our minds. And so the best place to go, the root of what animates Ignatian spirituality is the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. I'm sure a lot of you have had experience with that, maybe either reading about or being led through parts of that or the whole version of that retreat. And so what I've been having a growing appreciation of the wisdom of Ignatius and what Ignatian spirituality brings to this environmental movement, this dysfunctional relationship to nature. Ignatius just reminds us we are creatures, right? What a simple but important lesson that we are creatures. It sounds like an insult a little bit. I think that was one of those weird characters in Harry Potter, was creature, had weird hands. It sounds bad. But if there's a creature, if you are a creature, it means you have a creator, right? Basic tenet of spiritual life, of waking up and saying, I didn't make myself, right? So I think that's just a good reminder. And all that comes with being a creature. I teach ecology, and one of our main tools in ecology is a food web. And if you look at food webs from like the 40s and 50s and more like 60s and 70s, you'll often see like animals connected in a food web, and humans won't even be in it. It's like humans were just considered outside. We still didn't have this sense that we are part of nature, right? That's part of this integration. We're creatures. Ignatius gives the advice to spiritual directors when it comes to dealing with somebody who's praying through the exercises, let God deal directly with God's creation, right? And I have to remind myself that this was pretty revolutionary in Ignatius's day. He lived more in a context where you were encouraged to think of needing an intermediary, maybe a bishop or a priest or somebody to bring the faith to you. And Ignatius, the root of the exercises was that God will deal directly with an individual. That's why everything is so personally catered to the person. It's not a cookbook. It's not a formula because of the uniqueness of each one of us, right? So just praying with that would be enough to really bring in important integration, that we are creatures. And part of being a creature means you're part of the creation story. And we now know that that didn't just happen over 6 days. We know that there's this incredible 13.8 billion year creation story unfolding, and it puts us in that place, right? It gives us that fuller picture of who we are. And back to those Franciscans, I think I love the way that they talked about creation as the first revelation of God, right? What else could it be before the Bible was written down? How would humans have experienced the Creator? I know one of my favorite Franciscan teachers, Richard Rohr, talks about nature as the first Bible. I think that's not only true in human history, I think in our individual lives. Do you remember before you could or would ever want to read a religious text? How do you think you were experiencing moments when you're flipping rocks and catching tadpoles and crawdads? I think those are some of our first very important experiences of God. Maybe we just weren't encouraged to think that way. So a lot of fruitful ways that I like to bring these ideas into my own prayer. And of course, gratitude being the basic. We can always just pray for our creature comforts, like, thank you for this food that made its way to me, right? Like, I need food. I'm not above that. I'm a creature. But praying with where that food came from, that's what links us into those food webs, is these basic things, just like any other animal. So pretty beautiful stuff to pray with and think about. And then maybe even deeper into this, and what some people say, the culmination of the spiritual exercises, so sorry for the spoiler alert, but Ignatius talks about the contemplation to attain divine love. And maybe you've seen these words straight out of the exercises. Reflect on how God dwells in creatures, in elements, in animals, that dwelling of God in everything. I mean, if we really let that seep in, you can never exhaust that, right? And similarly, God laboring and working in keeping everything here, keeping everything present, including us, right? He includes, maybe I cut that part out, but he does include, remember this applies to us as well. So Ignatius had that wisdom too. So simple ways that this taps into hopefully maybe a pre-existing prayer life for you, but just I think it can help enliven it. It brings in a Trinitarian aspect of God, which was very important for Ignatius, and it just reminds us what a huge, broad, wide way that our God is working, and we're part of that story. All right, and then the question would be, well, what about specifically the Jesuits and the way we live our mission? How has this care for creation concept already played out? I had the good fortune of being with an older Jesuit, Father Richard Bauman. He's done a lot in the society, quite the character. A lot of young Jesuits do good impersonations of him. He's that kind of guy. And he was provincial, and he's been at big global meetings. And I asked him, like, hey, Richard, what would you say to a group full of people? And we're just talking about how has ecology, care for creation played out in the history of the Jesuits, more recent history of the Jesuits. And he said, I'll think about that. And he came, and he slipped under my door this Xerox piece of paper, and it's cute to think that people are still Xeroxing things. And I think I have a photo of that here. He said, Mark, here's the breakdown of GC 35, this big meeting that happened in 98. And he said, not sure what it would have been for GC 36, but clearly the fourth apostolic preference or care for creation has been simmering for a while. It's been simmering for a while. And I thought, that's a good way of putting it. That's what I found too. This is just a breakdown to say that they calculated all the different mentions of different important topics. And ecology, action, lifestyle, mission around ecology was part of conversations in 2007, March of 2007. And if you look back, I'll do the brief research for you. You can find some more substantial documents that started to come out. In 1999, Father Kulvenbach, the head of the Jesuits at that time, asked for this report to be made called We Live in a Broken World. So it's kind of a synthesis of ecological information, reflections on ecology. You can look and see that in 2011, there was a further document, Healing a Broken World, and Father General made a task force of people, mostly Jesuits. I was interested to see this name, Nancy Tuckman at Loyola University, a laywoman who was part of this, who I've had the good pleasure to meet since then. But these people around the world who are starting to talk about what does this have to mean for our mission? And then finally, in 2013, what's the spirituality that reconciles us with creation? So there's a lot of information out there, by the way. I'd be happy to be a resource, or a quick Google search will take you to these PDFs. It's been out there, but the question remained, do you really feel that compelled to go look at one of these reports? I don't. I might look at like the front and be like, oh, that's interesting. 23 pages, and like a foreword and all that. I'm not sure. Well, people like Nancy Tuckman and another lay professor at Loyola, Mike Shook, they really asked, how do we get this and like get it out to people that they'll actually use it so it's not a PDF? How do we get it so it's taught not only to adults but to students? And they created this awesome project called Healing Earth. Can I just get a quick raise of hand if you've ever heard of Healing Earth? A smattering. I think it hasn't gotten out there as much as I would like. So now you'll know that it's this online living textbook. So it's free. You can go to Healing Earth. You can type in Healing Earth and find it in Google. It's got a nice intro. It's got chapters on biodiversity, on water, on agriculture, all the basic things of an environmental science class. But it's written to integrate environmental science, ethics and morality, and Ignatian spirituality. And so it's having examples from around the world as well, not just the US, to try to say, how do we get this information out to students? How does it kind of get developed into pedagogy with cooler pictures in those orange PDFs as well? So I'd encourage you to check this out and maybe see if there's ways you could incorporate it into your teaching. So this is just a reminder, take a quick little stretch break. And actually, if you could just turn to a neighbor or your table, and I just want you to mention something that has struck you in the first part of this. So I'd like to hear some chitter chatter. Ask, hey, what stuck out to you? What questions or comments do you have? So talk amongst yourselves for a minute, please. How are things back here? Is it working out okay?
Oh, yeah, working well.
Excellent. That's cool.
I didn't ask you what you wanted. Would you prefer vegetarian or?
If that's an option, I would appreciate that. Okay. Thank you so much, Diane. So far, so good? Okay, good.
I like the stretch break.
Which one do you identify with most here? I'd say wisdom figure right there in the middle, the owl stretching. That's what it is. Maybe give it 30 seconds to wrap up your thoughts, please. Oh yeah, we're still going. We're still going. All right. I heard some good snippets. I'm glad you weren't only talking about the cutest animal here. I thought that was a dangerous move. That could have been the conversation. But maybe take the ideas you heard or that you shared, and that can come up in the Q&A at the end. I would love that. I did hear somebody say, this has been simmering. It's not a new thing. It's not just some pet idea of mine, obviously. This has been a long time coming, a long time integrating. Okay, so one of the big parts of a Jesuit way of proceeding, another buzzword, is discernment, right? And I was privileged to be a part of a society-wide, a global society discernment that Jesuits and lay people alike were a part of. Father General asked everybody around the world to have a couple meetings, have some prayer prompts, and say, what do we think the 4 main topics moving forward should be that kind of frames our mission? You all know that the Jesuits do a lot of things, right? It's a great thing. But we need to, sometimes it's nice to have kind of preferences identified. I was surprised that caring for our common home was one of those. Obviously, it was kind of a thing I was interested in, but I couldn't have told you that the Global Society and Ignatian community would identify that as one of the 4. And hopefully you've heard that when we think about caring for our common home, it's going to integrate the other 3 as well, and vice versa. But it shows that there's a need, and it shows that there's been prayerful discernment, not just kind of strictly a reactionary, but a prayerful way of moving forward. And I just wanted to mention one of the ways, a couple examples of how I've seen that playing out in Jesuit communities and beyond. So when I went, shortly after the 4th UAP was named, I went to Loyola University. I met a group of like-minded Jesuits, some of them already my friends, and we said, hey, we're all interested in this. Let's try to talk and be a little more efficient. How can we be better? How can we live more sustainably, and how can we talk about this more? So we formed what we called a green team. And right away we got into, mostly we looked at a couple different things. We looked at, how can we educate ourselves better internally? How can we just have a better lifestyle change? And then also, how do we reach out to students and others? And so we started thinking about that. But part of it was just making basic changes like where our waste went. Loyola University makes that easy, but we had to make the adjustments in our communities. We looked at, we were able to switch all our soaps to the bio soap that Loyola makes from our biodiesel lab. And so there was this is pretty cool. We got an electric vehicle. We now have 2 electric vehicles. And that was a deliberate discernment about when we need to buy a new car, let's look into getting an electric one. So that was good, and we learned a lot. But 2 things kind of shook out to help us discern the way forward. The first one was just saying, we need to make sure, that word again, how do we integrate it so it's not just like the 5 or 6 or 10 people interested in ecology stuff, and it's like that hobby group, right? How do we make sure that this spreads to everybody and everybody feels included in the process moving forward? And then second, a big one, how do we collect data? If a big mission is to reduce our footprint and our carbon footprint, reduce from what, right? You need to know some of those numbers. So we knew that was a big step. That was the next step. Don't need to read the print. Just know that this thing on the right is a summary from a big carbon footprint audit that we did. A lot of this happened even after I left. We got things rolling, and we said, let's start doing there's a lot of information out there of how to create an audit for yourself. And we did it. We included the community, but it was mostly that group of Green Team Jesuits. We got to see, actually, our utilities make up a bigger chunk than we thought. Transportation is 21%, food is 21%. Now we know where to focus and be a little more efficient, right? So that was kind of step 1, which was helpful and important. Step 2 was saying, how do we integrate this into us being Jesuits and how we move forward? Well, part of being a Jesuit, it's pretty typical that we have a community night. There's a night of the week where you make sure everybody ropes that off and you're there for dinner. And oftentimes we'll have maybe a topic that we discuss or a document or something. So we said, let's do a community night on ecology stuff, and let's show everybody the report. So we gave everybody a copy of that audit, and then we said, could you tell us one thing, what do you even consider to be an environmental work? Because some people were on different pages about that. Second one was, what did you notice in the audit? Did anything stick out to you? Any ideas prompted? Third one was just trying to dream a little bit. If you weren't limited, thinking beyond limitations, what could you really see us being better about in caring for our common home? And then finally, would you be open to us doing more if that was a way forward? This was helpful because if people see that we're changing something about where we put our waste and they don't know why, it can be resistant. But if they know that this is part of an intentional movement that they help discern, that's how we integrate it, and that's how we help empower and include people, right? So that was really important. And unbeknownst to us, the young, impressionable novices, the Jesuits who are out at our novitiate, they heard about this process, just some chatting with people. And so, just so you know, our novitiate, where I met Tom and Andrew, is out in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it's a place where a bunch of the younger guys live and for the first 2 years and kind of discern, is this right for me? Kind of like an engagement period, we sometimes say, before vows. You also have a lot of time on your hands sometimes, which Father Pip could tell you stories about pros and cons of that. One pro is that you can ask questions like this. And so a subgroup of novices that are into this kind of thing feel this is important already, said, let's create our own audit. Let's just use our receipts and our bills and create an audit. They did that. Then they made a committee to raise some discernment questions to the whole group, and then they prayed through it as a community. So they met and they asked these questions. They said, how is the Spirit calling me as an individual to conversion towards greater common care for our common home? What are some changes? And then what about as a novitiate community? So once again, it's just getting at that idea of like, it would have been easy to just kind of trudge forward and say, these are the changes we're making, but people would definitely feel left out or just not be educated in the process. And it's really neat that after they did this community discernment, the community, all of the 20-something novices decided, they came up, long story short, they said, let's have 2 strictly vegetarian meals a week. It's a big way to reduce your carbon footprint and be intentional. And then they said, we'll go ahead and not have red meat as beef in any of our meals. That's something they discern together. And on the weekends, you can do whatever you want to. I'm sure guys are sneaking double cheeseburgers and stuff. But that was a collective decision for how they would do it as community. And then the other part was, let's look at our HVAC system. Let's look at our heating and cooling. It's really inefficient. We live in an old monastery that like some rooms are hot, some rooms are cold. That's a good way to lower your footprint if you have the means for it at the time. Awesome, right? And everybody signed on to that. They agreed that this is our way of moving forward. That way you can complain a little bit, but you can also say, yeah, I was heard. I was heard. Even if I don't agree with it, I was heard and I learned about it. So we can ask ourselves here, what might that, we call it the 4th UAP, that 4th Universal Apostolic Preference, care for creation, what might that look like at the university level? And maybe just an example, a case study. I know you're doing great things here already. I've seen some of the things John Carroll is doing. I'm in the context of Loyola University. We had this impressive Institute of Environmental Sustainability, IES, last year, got upgraded to a school. The person that's very responsible for so much of this is Dr. Nancy Tuckman. I'm sorry I screenshotted the cursor right on her forehead. Sorry, Nancy. But I know some of you know Nancy. Ed knows Nancy. Incredible. And Ed was sharing beforehand that Nancy was part of an Ignatian, what was the name of that program?
Ignatian Colleagues Program.
Ignatian Colleagues Program. I'm sure you've seen some variation of a chance to learn a little bit more about mission, integrated into what you do, what you want to do. Nancy Tuckman is a rock star example of what that can look like and the ripple effects that can have. Her way of incorporating what we need to be asking ourselves when we ask, how can we incorporate the broader Jesuit mission beyond just ecology stuff? She has found a way to incorporate that into the decisions made at the School of Environmental Sustainability. Very, very impressive person to work for. And then finally, I think what Nancy has done so well, and I think we should all be thinking this way in light of integration, is how do we make sure this isn't just an SES thing or just that, you guys have that nice new science building? Well, not new, but it looks new. How can we make sure what's going on there, especially sustainability-wise, goes to every other department? You all know better than I do that universities can become siloed, right? And so it's, well, what would this look like in an English department and maybe in the pedagogy there too? So how does it integrate across? And so if you're wondering, okay, great, like what do we do? Well, another one of those really impressive top-down moments is happening right now from the Vatican. The highest point, the Vatican said Laudato Si was great, the information is out there, how do we put it on the ground into action? And has anybody heard of the Laudato Si action platform before? Good, I see some hands. I know a lot of people haven't seen this yet. And it's this collective effort to say, how do we implement Laudato Si into the church? And so there were 7 goals that were identified to help kind of clarify different areas where we can kind of fine-tune our efforts. You can think to yourself, oh, where would I fit best into this? If you're an economist, maybe that would be easy. Yes?
Thank you for bringing this up. On Sunday night, our president, Dr. Mackey at the student mass, announced that we have joined the journey to become a Laudato Si campus. And that was part
Give
of
yourselves a round of applause really quick for that. Woo! Excellent.
He put that in a message to the community at the beginning of Mission Week. So
Perfect.
thanks for the plug.
Opportunity to live the mission. And that mission will include asking, what would these 7 goals look like at John Carroll? But the other part of this is the church is a big thing, and we wear multiple hats too. So they've identified 7 different sectors in which this plan will be lived out. Those 7 goals will be lived out. 7 is that special number. And of course, John Carroll is going to be at educational institutions. And Professor Mike Shook at Loyola was asked by the Vatican to head up the committee that has gathered universities around the world. There's over 160 now, probably more than that, John Carroll being one of those, to commit, to say, we will live this out, right? We'll do our best over 7 years. I think there's some wisdom in that. This isn't an overnight thing, and it's not we've done it, check the box. One thing I like about it, too, is that the 7th year is actually a year of repose, rest, and jubilation, just like the creation story. So that should be a fun year. And just a quick, you can Google this on your own time, but there's a website for that you're now part of, the Laudato Si Universities. It can highlight what does that look like. You can't condense it into a talk or to a mass announcement. So check that out on your own time, and you can see what the next few years look like. And you can maybe start to dream. This top-down support from Laudato Si and the Pope to the Jesuits, I think opens up a lot of doors for you to say, if you go and have a good idea to somebody, it's going to be hard for Ed to shut you down and say, nah, that's just not what we have resources for. Let's take advantage of that. It's being asked for. And so now you can also find even more updated, a little more colorful information. Here's a report you can check out on your own time. And there's even a section, that's too complicated, I'll skip that. There's just a reminder of how we fit into a broader branch and appreciating that. But there's a section for faculty and staff you could check out in there. It has some nice Laudato Si relevant quotes. And it also has some kind of points for reflection, as well as points for action. All right, so this final stretch I want to leave on a fun note and maybe an example, a way to imagine what can this look like. It's great to talk about it, but I get a lot of frustration of like, great, another Zoom committee on Care for Creation, but what will this look like? Like, what does it look like in Jesuit networks and communities? And so finally, I got to be a part of what it looks like on the ground. I was at Brebeuf Jesuit High School in Indianapolis. Part of my favorite part about being at Brebeuf was the 15 acres that are wooded along the campus where the cross-country trail goes. And I spent a lot of time out there, but in between my time there in 2017 and my time there in 2020, a major change happened. A pest called the emerald ash borer. You ever heard of the emerald ash borer? Came through, it's been through here, killed off all the white ash trees, which were a predominant part of the forest, left a lot of trees down, kind of was botched in the process of cutting things. It was going to be looking to restore. COVID happened, and then people on the maintenance crew were trying to clean up and were making the job worse with machinery. It was kind of a bad situation. So thankfully we could go in and hit pause and say, stop using machines in the woods. What can we do to better and restore this bit of land that we call our own, right, that we steward? And I must say, I wanted to just go in as like a pet project or maybe like my own gardening kind of time. Or maybe the other option was we just pay a contracting company. There's this Ecological contractor that said, we can do this for you. But thankfully, through my dimness, I had looked at these goals and I said, well, what's the way that we loop people into it, right? It's not just about fixing the problem. It's also how do we use this to connect community and use our network and make it a learning process, right? And we're at a high school. I mean, come on. We should be connecting people in, even though they didn't really know about this problem. So I went to the place that made a lot of sense. Brebeuf has a conservation club. I bet you there are some similar clubs here at John Carroll, right? Full of young people that are willing to contribute and want to contribute, but maybe aren't sure how. So this was a perfect example to channel those energies, right? So we went, and I made the following kind of quick pitch to the students there. I said, hey, this was my pitch here, these next couple slides. I said, how can we make this more than just a contracted project? how can we get students and faculty and staff to feel more ownership and engagement in this and learn along the way? And how can we get hands-on experience in this ecological plan, restoration plan, especially after we've been cooped up in COVID and hadn't been able to see each other much? So a thought had occurred to me. Now, I have an eccentric brother-in-law. He is into restoring native prairie grass places, restoring native biodiversity in lawns. And he called the family together one weekend, and he said, hey, can you help me with this thing called winter sowing? Has anybody done winter sowing? I'm sure there's some better gardeners in here than me, but it's just a way, yeah? Okay, you've dabbled. It's a way of getting seeds started, right? You've heard of starting seeds, but native plants actually need to be cold and frozen. But if you can set up a little natural environment for them where they don't have competition, but they still get cold and sunlight, you can grow these little mini greenhouses. And my brother-in-law did that to restore this whole chunk of prairie grass in his lawn here. And I said, that's pretty easy. We can do that. So then we said, how about this? Let's make these miniature do-it-yourself greenhouses. And that can be a way to grow the plants we know that the consultants told us we can plant in this cleared out area. So I said, what do you think? Can you, Conservation Club, help me organize? Of course, right? No problem, Brother Mark. Like we can do a drive. This is what we do. So we started asking for the milk jugs. And then 2, what about just making these things? So like immediately the Conservation Club starts putting together things, advertising, using their creative talents. We picked a time and a day. We put out a pitch in the school newsletter saying, please bring in your empty containers. Here's why. After I gave the initial pitch, a student comes up to me on the leadership board and he says, oh, Brother Mark, I own my own organic landscaping company. Could I help you out? And I was like, yes, you can. And that's okay. So he was able to get a bunch of soil for cheap, looping in students. They started advertising. The president, Emily of the club, had this great idea to make these little name tags to let people know little fun facts about the plants, the biodiversity they were planting. This was coneflower. We had maybe some other familiar looking native plants that students could sow, could start to plant. Let's see if this works. They put this together. Get an empty milk jug. You don't need to worry about the subprint. There it is. I didn't even have to ask, will you make this video? They just made the video and did a great job with it. That song gets stuck in my head. And we had our day. We had a couple days because we were on hybrid model where students could come into an empty lab during their free period and start making mini greenhouses. They could pick the plants they wanted to, and it was just a lot of fun. A lot of students came out. Some people made pictures in the memes about it, and we ended up having over 300 little do-it-yourself greenhouse jugs that were built just over those 2 days. So the students showed up and had a lot of fun and learned in the process. We were able to get these set up outside. Students had the option to take them home if they wanted, the option to take them home if they wanted to watch them grow in their own backyard, because you keep them outside on the deck. And we had another couple hundred at this school. And so then we were able to let them start germinating. Faculty and staff wanted to be included, so we incorporated this into that year's retreat. Along with activities of taking care of our campus, everybody made their own milk jug. The Social Justice Club stepped up and said, we'll help in the transplanting of these to our nursery gardens. Our AP Environmental Science classes helped in the part of where you need to identify. So as we came up with needs, we had people that were willing, more than willing and capable to come in and help. So an incredible kind of energy of its own, tapping into this need that we have, but also a desire that people have. And that's what we're looking for, that overlap, right? And the latest iteration, and this is the final slide, the latest iteration here is we realized Crooked Creek is the stream that goes right through campus, right past the Jesuit residence, and right near where our restoration area is. Well, if you look on a map and you follow it down, if you could go in a little kayak, 20 miles. It goes all the way down to where Crooked Creek flows into the White River in Indianapolis. And right near that confluence is Marian University, a small Catholic Franciscan university where a couple of Brebeuf alums are. Scott knows what I'm talking about. And now we're in the process of, we've partnered up with the university and some professors there, and we're going to start having a collaboration where students can go and work on their eco lab on campus, and their students can come to Brebeuf, and we can start to create our own mini eco lab at Brebeuf's campus. So literally, we're connected by the watershed and a creek that you could follow through. Everybody lives downstream. And we're connected by the common faith of the church that we're both a part of. So an incredible collaborative coming together that's still happening. Who knows what the next iterations will be. But it just reminds me that sincere ecological conversion and the kind that we need, Pope Francis says, is always going to be community conversion. So this doesn't happen siloed off. But when we're doing it and we're open to it, we're going to be pulling other people with us in the process, making our communities better and more happy and fun places to be. So that's it. Thank you all for your attention. And if you have any questions or points you want to raise, I'm happy to hear that. So thanks again. Yeah.
Do the Audit platform items intersect formally with like the U.S. Sustainable Development Goals?
They do, yes. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals help to kind of inspire the way of thinking about that. So yeah, it's a good point, and maybe you're already familiar with those, but the work of connecting the dots and making them in our church context is kind of already done for you. Yeah, thanks for that.
You present such a hopeful picture of what a community can do in this area, but oftentimes the news we get about ecology in the world is that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, that
Sure.
things are not good. And so, as a scientist, what's your sense of all that? The dangers of ecological crisis, et cetera.
Can everybody hear that question? Yeah. Tomorrow will bring worries of its own, for sure. We know that, especially in terms of the environment. And since I started my undergrad and then graduate career, let's say around 2008, the sentiment for me was, all this stuff is happening. Biodiversity crisis, climate change, nobody's talking about it or even seems to know about it, except for little sectors. We've kind of almost all the way flipped to where it's now making headlines. It's now reached people's consciousness, but I'd say in some ways the pendulum swung almost too far. It's a fine line. If you ask people, well, we want to make sure we light a fire under people so that they feel motivated and realize this is important. And that's true. But teaching students at both the high school and at Loyola, I've found when you ask students, whether conscious or subconscious, a lot of people are carrying around really bleak ideas of the future, desolate ideas of a really bad future. And there's a balance in there, because if you read the IPCC reports, the International Panel on Climate Change, that produces these major official reports that a lot of our information is synthesized and based on, there is no scenario where it says humanity might go extinct from this. But I think a recent study said that over 50% of Americans, when indicated, think that, yeah, like climate change might make the human species extinct. So there is this disconnect between what the science is actually saying and what these reports are saying. Now, don't hear me saying it's not a big deal. That's not it, right? But we need to get away from these dichotomies that aren't helpful. And so walking this line between, but I think enough people know how dire the circumstances are. So, and I think when we do link it to our Christian faith, it's got to have hope in it, right? I was perplexed when I met a couple Jesuits, like 2 or 3 Jesuits that have careers in science, and they indicated a hopelessness. And I get where they're coming from, because if you, day in, day out, learn about the state of the environment, like our students do that are majors, it can be a desolate place. But as Christians, you'd hope that we'd have, but there's a sense of where's God's role in this. And so I'm constantly, that's definitely the root of my hope. I think there's some scientifically based optimism in there too. But I think the dark message will be out there regardless. I think we have less of a problem of people being oblivious to just how serious this situation is. So It's a good question that I find myself kind of navigating between, but more and more I find myself a voice to say, yeah, change your lifestyle, maybe even major in this, make some major life decisions, but don't think that don't think that the world's going to end in 50 years or that we're beyond hope. It's a tough line to walk. I'm sure a lot of you are walking that line right now as well. Yes?
Of course, there's plenty of people who don't think that it's dire and are investing a lot of money and time and trying to buy that narrative.
Yeah, I think all of us, I know personally, I've learned a lot about how naive I was 3 years ago about what people can hear. You just present them the facts and we'll be on the same page now, right? And I think COVID has shown us that it's more complicated than that. I guess what I would just say is that, you want to, if there's a place where you can educate a person, and that's where ecological literacy is helpful, to be able to point to an actual study versus just kind of saying, well, I'm pretty sure it is this way. So being well-read and versed in these things is really helpful for that. But I would also say I'd lean back maybe to what Pope Francis gave us. He might run into the same problems that people can just say, well, that's Pope Francis. He's not my Pope, right? Some people can always take that opinion. But what I think is really hard to argue or get around is he showed us that the cry of the earth is the cry of the poor. That the first people to be negatively impacted, whether it's climate change or even if it's just ecological degradation, are the poor and vulnerable. So even a good humanist will kind of see yeah, that's true. And there's umpteen different examples that we can show. And a lot of times it's with indigenous groups. A lot of times it could be poor people in the South in the US. So I think if they get too caught up and it's too politicized with the environmental and climate change part, you can just say, well, we know that looking out for the poor and the vulnerable is a good way to go, and that's going to include some mitigation efforts. So that might be, that's what I found a nice kind of, at least try to find some common ground to have a constructive conversation that any Christian should we would hope would be open to. Yeah.
This kind of goes along with what Father Smith's comment was, and that's one of our greatest hopes in this.
Which part picking up steam, the kind of passion of young people on this topic?
Yes.
I'd say for sure. The passion's going to be there. And as far as people thinking about, will people stay in the church or our institutions? The question is, are you going to stifle that passion and say bees are political? I would publicly say that's kind of ridiculous. But, and that's maybe the shadow side of the churches dealing with this, right? Whereas I would focus on the gratitude I have of the privilege of being in a Jesuit institution where that wouldn't happen. Your daughter wouldn't be shut down. And I think we're trying, and we've been late to it, but I think we're seeing this is a natural passion, and let's cultivate it, and that's from God. And Pope Francis has some great quotes on that. I have a couple in my presentation for the students. But yeah, it is becoming, the younger generations are the most ecologically aware. It takes some humility for older people to say, oh, maybe I can learn from my own kid. But there's passion there, and it's sometimes, that's why I want to keep that numinous, that faith aspect that has the wonder and awe in it about how incredible bees are. Bees are mentioned in the Exultant at Easter. It's like in the liturgy. That's awesome. She should tell that to her administrators at the Catholic school. But, there's a passion there. Sometimes there's a fine line, I'm sure you've all seen, between that passion tipping just to a negativity. Maybe that's where discernment, Ignatian discernment can come in. Which spirit is informing us? This is an Ignatian spirituality thing. The evil spirit could have a field day with just using negative and strong emotions to divide. So we as educators should recognize that this is a passionate topic. It's sincere. We can recognize that. It's leading towards a desire for faith, hope, and love. But I think what we're also seeing in Catholic institutions that are too rigid is if they play that game, people will leave them. And we've had pockets. I think we've had examples in Jesuit high schools and even grade schools and universities to try to say, let's hear what's going on here and let's not just shut something down because it seems foreign. The climate change conference that Loyola is going to hold, it's going to be virtual, so easy to attend in March. It's encouraging digital posters and using art and creativity too. So that's something I've seen that your daughter would be interested in. It used to be art has no place in a scientific conference. And we're starting to recognize this isn't just like a strict scientific data-driven thing. The whole human's going to have other parts, including creative aspects. So maybe you should tell her to check that out. Yes?
Not that we need more ecological ideas of the cause?
Yeah, thanks for the question. How can young people foster ecological ideas? I think step number one needs to be caring about creation before you care for creation. So that can be taking like I don't know what the elective classes are. I teach a non-majors class. It's people that aren't like doing this as a career. But there's a lot of just basic literacy to learn about this. Like it's hard to talk about the importance of watersheds or pollinators if you just don't know. So that might be step one. It doesn't need to be formal. It could just be listening to a podcast that covers this kind of thing or YouTube videos. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. And then the other maybe biggest thing or tied into that is just exposure to nature. I think that's where you see like an inexhaustible passion that is sustained to people that actually have those lived experiences to be like, I understand it, and that's why I think it's important. Now, you can have action without those things, but I think that's the type of experiential experience that's going to continue and to really have a true lasting motivation. But otherwise, looking into clubs too. I think John Carroll's got some clubs, learning from your peers. I think those are all good entryways. But I think like recognizing there might be a bit to learn first before we jump in and use those voices. It kind of needs to start with that part. So you should, is anybody here in the sciences or sustainability here at John Carroll? Any adults that are part of that? I know there was a gentleman on the sustainability committee, but maybe that would be something we think about. Students that are interested, where can we funnel them to? And a lot of times that's just clicking on a website. So. Great. It's on now.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. You've given us so much during this lunchtime conversation. And please know that you always have a home at John Carroll University.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.